Can you hear that? It's the past, rustling gently in the heather. But before we go any further, take a moment to like, subscribe, and share this video so others might also fall asleep to the rhythm of old tales. Now, let yourself relax, breathe deeply, nestle into warmth. Tonight's journey takes us through ancient Celtic myths. Tangle with truth and imagination. Episode 4 begins now. So we have mostly been talking about the Celts on the European continent and the island of Britain, but in this lecture we'll focus on Ireland. And Ireland will of course play a very important role in the course from this point on. There's a lot to say about the early history of Ireland, but in this lecture I'm going to focus on a single question. How did Ireland wind up as a Celtic-speaking country? It clearly was by the time it enters the historical record. I'm going to answer the question in 3 ways that correspond to 3 different moments in time. First, we'll look at what the early Irish themselves thought they knew about their own prehistoric past. How did they become the Irish? We'll see their very intriguing and complicated national traditions on display. Second, we'll examine what modern scholars have made of these traditions. How have they thought about the question of the peopling of Ireland? And finally, we'll briefly look at some recent changes in how scholars understand early Irish history. We'll see that the answers to these questions differ substantially. Our picture of how Ireland became Celtic is quite different from what earlier generations of scholars believed. Some of these changes in our understanding of Celtic Ireland come from sources we're very familiar with by now: archaeological evidence and DNA analysis. But a lot of the changes in our views of Irish history have to do with changing interpretations of a very important text about early Ireland called the Book of Invasions. It's the origin story of the Irish people, and I'll spend most of the lecture today describing it and talking about how scholars have interpreted it. Before I start digging into the Book of Invasions, though, I want to make 2 important points about Ireland. The first point is this. In contrast to Britain and the continent, Ireland was never conquered by the Romans. In all the other areas where people spoke Celtic languages, except for the far north of Britain, the Celtic experience was dramatically shaped by the encounter with the Roman Empire. In some areas, such as Switzerland, the Romans almost entirely wiped out any trace of the language and culture of the Celtic speakers. In other places like Britain, Celtic speech survived, even if it was under pressure from Latin. But Ireland was different. It never experienced Roman rule. In a famous incident, the great Roman general Agricola, whom we have met before when he was suppressing British rebels in the period after the Great Revolt of Boudicca in the 60s AD, looked across the Irish Sea at Ireland and said, effectively, "We could take it if we wanted to." But they never did. And that meant that Ireland went through a lot of crucial developments without the direct influence of Rome. There were no Roman ruins in Ireland, no Roman road system. The Irish developed pretty much as they wanted to, without the experience of cultural imperialism that inevitably followed in the wake of the Roman legions. The second preliminary point I want to make about Ireland follows from the first. Because Ireland was not conquered by Rome, Irish society was not literate until the conversion to Christianity, which got started in the late 4th century, but it didn't take hold enough to produce lots of written texts until several centuries later. So it's one thing to say that the Irish kept their own traditions, while the rest of the Celtic world was succumbing to Roman domination. It's another thing entirely to know exactly what those traditions were. So how do we know anything about pre-Christian Ireland? Mostly we have to rely on texts written down after the conversion to Christianity. Fortunately, there are a lot of these texts. Ireland can boast not just the largest body of vernacular texts in a Celtic language, but in fact the largest body of texts to survive in any vernacular language from early medieval Europe. These texts come in all varieties. There is a lot of legal material because the Irish were extremely litigious. There's also a lot of genealogical material. In a society where claims to property were determined by family relationships, it was important to be able to tell who was related to whom. There's also an extensive body of texts that we would broadly consider literary, though they have elements of history and mythology mixed in. And the text I'm going to talk about today, the Book of Invasions, falls in that category. So we actually have quite a few texts that can give us a picture of the pre-Christian past. There is a problem with these sources, though, and I've already said what it is. It's the very fact that all of these texts were written down after the conversion. We can't date them precisely because some of them clearly refer to pre-conversion times, but how much they have been altered after the fact is hard to tell. Scholars are engaged in a great debate about how we can use these sources, and we'll get to that a little bit later in this lecture. For now, though, it's time to get to the text itself, so we can see what the early Irish thought they knew about their own past. This is the first moment in time when we'll look at the question of how Ireland came to be Celtic, each time through the lens of the same early Irish text. The main origin legend of the Irish, the story that explains how Ireland came to be populated, is called the Lever Gavala Éireann, which literally translates as the Book of the Takings of Ireland, but it's usually just called the Book of Invasions. According to this text, Ireland was populated by a series of invasions or takings by a whole series of different invaders, 6 waves of invasion in all. The text began to take shape starting in the 8th century, but we have it in versions that really crystallized in the 11th and 12th centuries. It is very, very difficult, and it must be said, not a page-turner, at least to the modern reader. It's confusing and hard to read. A lot of what is in the text is mainly about place names and genealogies. How did this lake or that plain get its name? Who was descended from whom? All fascinating to the original audience. But however much the medieval Irish loved it, it's pretty tough sledding to us. Furthermore, almost every part of the story is told both in prose and in poetry, and the two versions often conflict. It looks very much as if someone started out with a prose version and a poetry version and spliced them together without going back to get rid of the inconsistencies. So now that I've really whetted your appetite, here's how it goes, in what I can assure you is a simplified version. Ireland was uninhabited until 40 days before the Great Flood, when Kesser, the daughter of Bith, son of Noah, appeared on the island with 50 maidens and 3 men seeking refuge from the coming flood. But to no avail, because 40 days later they were all swept away by the rising waters, and Ireland was uninhabited again for the next 300 years. Of course, it's unclear how we know all this, but some versions of the story say that one of the 3 men was a poet named Fintan, who somehow survived the flood and passed on the tale. The details of how this happened are a little vague. So anyway, the next peoples to inhabit Ireland were a series of groups all descended from a different son of Noah named Japhet. The first were the followers of a guy called Partholón, a 7th generation descendant of Japhet, who arrived in Ireland on a Tuesday, we learn, which happened to be the 14th of the month. And I love the fact that the text provides that detail. But the Partholonians, as they were called, did not enjoy their prize unmolested for long, for soon thereafter a group of one-armed, one-legged giant pirates appeared, called the Fomorians, and a battle ensued. The first battle ever fought in Ireland was won by the Partholonians against the giants. Things didn't go well for the victors, though, since a plague soon came and killed them all, except for one who survived to tell the tale in the time of St. Columba in the 6th century. And I think you can tell here that the compiler of the text is struggling hard with the question of plausibility. You're probably starting to wonder if we're ever going to people this island at all. But the uninhabited phases are getting shorter. This time, just 30 years later, another group shows up. These are the followers of Nemet, a 10th generation descendant of Japhet, who came to Ireland by ship from the Caspian Sea. which was a pretty impressive feat of navigation under pre-modern conditions. The Numidians still had to deal with some renewed attacks from the Fomorians, and after Nemed himself died of the plague, the Numidians were cruelly oppressed by the Fomorian giants and were somehow still around. The Numidians had to hand over 2/3 of their wheat and their milk and even their offspring to the giants. Finally, the Numidians had had enough, and they rebelled under the leadership of 3 chieftains. There was an enormous battle, which led to yet another island-clearing cataclysm. The sea swallowed everyone up except for one Fomorian ship. Presumably this allows for a potential sequel where we can bring the giants back into the story. And one Numidian ship with 30 warriors on board. These 30 warriors soon split into 3 groups. One group goes to the northern islands, and we will hear more about them in a moment. One group goes to Britain, which conveniently makes the Irish the ancestors of the British. Ponder that for a moment. And the third group goes to, wait for it, Greece. We are now up to our 4th invasion, which is actually a sort of homecoming. For the descendants of the group of Numidians that had gone to Greece show up again. 230 years later, they had not had a good time in Greece. They were oppressed there too, just as they had been in Ireland under the Fomorians. The Greeks made them carry soil in bags from the tops of mountains down to make level the plains below. Because of the bags they had to use in their work, they were called the Fir Bolg, which literally means bagmen in Irish. So when the Fir Bolg got tired of carrying bags of dirt, they decided to flee, so they used the bags, which were probably made of skins of some kind, to make boats and sailed off to find their ancestral homeland. So back they sailed from Greece across the Mediterranean to Ireland. But once again, they did not enjoy possession of Ireland for long. Here comes invasion number 5. Remember, when the Numidians left Ireland, some of them went to Greece, and some went to the northern islands. The ones that went to the northern islands apparently spent their time learning magic and knowledge and sorcery and cunning. They too decided to come back to their ancestral homeland, so they invaded Ireland in the supernatural cloud of darkness, challenged the Firbolg to battle, and defeated them. And these newcomers were called the Tuatha De Danann, the peoples of the goddess Danu. The Tuatha De Danann were an impressive lot. Both men and women practiced various crafts, and some clearly had the aspects of gods, such as Ogma, the patron of learning and writing. Ogma is actually depicted on the door of the Adams Building at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and he earns his place there because he was the legendary inventor of the Irish system of writing known as Ogham, which was supposedly named after him. And it's interesting that Ogma is seen opposite the Cherokee chief Sequoyah, who actually did invent an alphabet for the Cherokee language. There is also Nuadu Aragat Lav, Nuadu of the Silver Hand, who lost an arm in the battle with the Firbolg. The healer Dian Kecht made him a replacement arm of silver, with joints that really worked, very much like Luke Skywalker after his fight with Darth Vader. So Ireland is now being ruled by a magical people with all sorts of supernatural powers. But not for long. Get ready for the 6th and final invasion. It turns out that there were other people around who were wandering the world looking for a permanent home. This time, descendants of Japhet in the 4th generation. That is to say, they are more closely related to Noah than the Partholonians or the Numidians. Now I have to warn you, this is where it gets even weirder. This new group of Japhet's descendants had ended up in the Middle East, where their progenitor Nail was born at the Tower of Babel. He was then sent for by Pharaoh and married Pharaoh's daughter Skara. And this is supposedly why the Irish are called Scots. Nail and Skara had a son named Goidel Glass, who was a very talented linguist. He took the 72 languages from the Tower of Babel, combined them all together, and made a new language called Gaelic or Irish. And believe me, Irish looks like it could have been made from 72 languages. But in the context of the story, this is supposed to be a compliment. Things were about to get politically difficult in Egypt, though, because Pharaoh ran afoul of a guy named Moses. So after Pharaoh died in the Red Sea, the Gaels, as they became known, went into exile and took to the sea. See the pattern. This episode was apparently very important in the tradition associated with this text. There is a wonderful 15th century Scottish illustrated manuscript depicting the voyage of the Gaels, as we may now call them, out of Egypt. And notice I said it's a Scottish manuscript. This story is also an important origin story for the Scots, who you will remember came originally from Ireland. More on that in a later lecture. So the Gaels wandered around the Mediterranean for many years in search of a permanent home. Along the way, they encountered mermaids, whose call was so enticing that they had to stuff their ears with wax to avoid being drawn in by their dangerous charms. After wandering for 300 years, they landed in Spain and conquered it. And their leader, a man named Miel, ruled over Spain. They built a tall tower, a very tall tower, as we'll see in a moment. After Miel died, his sons Ever and Erivon ruled in his place. One day, their uncle Eth, who was a very learned man, went to the top of the tower and thought he could see, way off in the distance, the shadow of a land far away. He told his nephews Ever and Erivon that he would like to visit that land, so he set off with some companions. When he got to that land, which turned out to be Ireland, of course, he found the ruling Tuatha De Danann in the midst of an internal quarrel over property. Seeing that Eth was a wise man, the contending parties asked Eth for his judgment on the case. He essentially told them, "This is a beautiful, rich country, and there's enough here for everyone. Why are you quarreling?" Instead of making them feel better, this got them to thinking that Eth was planning to invade and settle there, so they killed him. When the survivors of the expedition got back to Spain, Eth's nephews were outraged and decided to avenge their uncle, so they set off for Ireland in their turn. Now, the Tuatha were pretty tricky customers, so they enveloped Ireland in a sort of cloaking device, so that the sons of Miel ended up sailing around Ireland 3 times before finally landing on Thursday the 17th. They went to Tara and demanded one of 3 things: battle, or kingship, or judgment. In the negotiations, the Tuatha agreed that the sons of Miel would rule Ireland henceforth, if they could first sail over 9 waves and then return. This seemed like a good deal, so the Gaels got in their ships and sailed away. But of course it was a trick. The crafty Tuatha called up a supernatural wind that sent up huge waves. Luckily, Ever and Erivon had another brother named Averion, who was a bard, and he sang a song to the island of Ireland, asking that they be allowed to land, and the winds quieted. When the sons of Miel got to Ireland, they defeated the Tuatha in battle and they fled over the sea. Though some versions of the story say that they were exiled below the ground, and thus this is the origin of the fairy mounts. The sons of Miel then divided Ireland into 2 halves. Erivon the elder got the northern half, and Ever got the south. And thus they are the ancestors of 2 major ruling dynasties of Ireland in north and south. Everyone in Ireland is thus a descendant either of the sons of Miel or of the people they conquered. And I'm happy to say that with the arrival of the sons of Miel, the Gaels, we've actually peopled Ireland at last. And this is what the Irish believed about how their island was peopled down through the Middle Ages and beyond. But starting as early as the 16th century, scholars in other countries, especially England, began to cast some doubt upon this story. We have arrived now at the second moment I want to talk about, the era of modern scholarship. Skeptical English scholars started to raise concerns about all of these giants and magic mists and so forth. It gradually dawned on most people, even the Irish themselves, that the stories in the Book of Invasions could not be literally true in every detail. But what if these stories preserved a kernel of truth? What if they at least represented actual traditions that had been handed down from the immemorial Celtic past? Here we come back to the debate I mentioned at the beginning about the way in which we use Irish sources written down after the Irish converted to Christianity. The older view of this question is that you could actually trust these sources very much. There's a very famous formulation by the great historian and linguist Kenneth Hurlstone Jackson, who wrote an article in 1964 that claimed that early Irish texts could be read as if they opened up a window on the Iron Age. Scholars like Jackson became known as the nativist school because they believed that what you see in early Irish texts is a fairly pure representation of authentic Irish tradition. They argued that Irish literature was essentially conservative and that it had preserved an unbroken link to the remote pagan past, all the way back to a common Celtic culture and even to a common Indo-European culture many thousands of years ago. The nativist argument rested on two main theories. The first theory is that there did indeed exist, at one time, a common Indo-European culture that spread all over Europe with the spread of Indo-European languages, of which Celtic is of course a major subgroup, and then a common Celtic culture, of which the Irish language is a major constituent. The second theory is that such a culture could genuinely be preserved over very long periods by oral transmission. But the nativists needed a way to explain how such texts could really preserve material from thousands of years ago. The breakthrough came in the late 1950s and early 1960s from work done by Albert Lord and Dennis Page on the way oral traditions are preserved. Lord and Page argued from their studies of the Iliad and other Greek texts that oral tradition could preserve a record of archaic society and remain unchanged when it was finally written down. They thought the Iliad probably did represent a work first composed in the remote past and handed down orally for many centuries until it was finally committed to writing. Now, this theory gave a lot of hope to scholars of Ireland like Jackson, who really wanted to use these post-conversion sources to create a picture of early Irish society. Jackson claimed in 1964 that the Irish texts are very archaic in appearance, very circumstantial, and on the whole, very consistent, and that they belong to a period some centuries older than the time when they were first written down, belong, in fact, to a prehistoric Ireland. So here is the warrant for using early texts as a window on the Iron Age. But even if you accept that the texts do represent the survival of an ancient tradition, there's another big question you need to ask, namely, why Christian scholars in the period after the conversion would have taken the trouble to preserve all of this pagan material. I mean, magic mists, one-eyed giants. The fact that everything seems to come in multiples of three ships, 30 men, 300 years, etc., and I could go on. There has to be some explanation for recording all of this patently un-Christian behavior. The nativists came up with a theory that can never be proven completely from the evidence, but you can see what you think. They argued that the early Irish scholars, Christians though they were, had a deep respect for and love of their heritage, and that they wanted to preserve it before it was lost. The nativists imagined the early scholars as heritage buffs, who were not especially troubled by the pagan stuff they were recording. It was their native history, after all. The nativists do concede, reluctantly it seems, that the texts show a few signs of monastic censorship. Characters who are obviously originally gods or goddesses are sometimes depicted as mere human beings, like the Tuatha De Danann, but they're willing to overlook these few lapses and cling gratefully to the mass of authentic material that the texts preserve. Now, we'll never be able to get completely inside the minds of the people who recorded these texts, but I think it's rather touching that modern scholars have imagined these ancient scholars to be rather a lot like them. So nativists might proceed from the assumption that maybe these texts represent memories of an actual series of migrations to Ireland that correspond to major changes in technology. They have even tried to make connections between the archaeological evidence for different layers of cultural influence and the different peoples in the story. Maybe the Fir Bolg represent the first Neolithic farmers, for example. Maybe the Tuatha De Danann are the first people who could work metal. What about the Celts? You may remember that I talked in an earlier lecture about how 19th century scholars conceived of the Celts as originating in Central Europe and spreading outward by conquest. They supposedly arrived in Britain and Ireland as invaders in either one wave or two waves depending on the theory. Doesn't this sound an awful lot like the Book of Invasions? Of course, the Celtic origin theory has the Celts coming from Central Europe, not Spain. But perhaps there is even an explanation for the otherwise odd-seeming Spanish connection. There is in fact a region in northwest Spain known as Galicia that has Celtic roots. The name is etymologically related to the word Gaelic. Perhaps, many scholars have argued, the story of the Sons of Meal represents the memory of real migration from Spain by people of Gaelic speech. I will have more to say about Galicia in a future lecture. So what you see here is that scholars up through the mid-20th century were trying to figure out ways to harmonize the Book of Invasions with their ideas of how the Celts spread out from Hallstatt and Laten, or possibly even from Galicia. The nativist view is thus a very optimistic view of how we can use these Irish texts in combination with modern scholarship to paint a picture of how Ireland came to be a Celtic nation. But now we come to the third moment at which I want to examine the question of how Ireland was peopled. Since the 1990s, the pendulum has swung in a more pessimistic direction with regard to how much we can use these texts to tell us what pre-Christian Irish traditions actually were. More recent scholars such as Kim McCone have done a lot of textual analysis, and they are much more skeptical than earlier scholars like Kenneth Jackson about the notion that these texts preserve the pure pre-Christian past. For one thing, they have found a lot more Christian stuff in these texts than the earlier scholars did. The narratives have often been shaped to conform to biblical models, and in short, we clearly cannot read them as unself-conscious records of the pre-Christian past. They're not even intended to be that. So you've got deliberate distortions being inserted to suit the ideology of the scribes recording the stories. To take the Book of Invasions as an example, we have a basic fact that strikes every reader of the text. The narrative has been harmonized with the chronology of the Bible. We have Noah, we have Moses and Pharaoh, etc. We basically have the Irish wandering around like a 13th tribe of Israel. So clearly, if these are ancient native traditions, they have been wedged into an explicitly Christian worldview. Furthermore, the Bible is not the only non-Irish text that has influenced the Book of Invasions. Remember the mermaids and the need to put wax in your ears to resist their siren call? That is straight out of the Odyssey. So these texts really represent a mishmash of native traditions and Christian and classical influences. And the task of disentangling these elements to recover a pure, lost original is probably hopeless. Furthermore, as if that were not worrisome enough, new doubt has been cast on the idea of oral transmission as an inherently conservative process. New work on living oral traditions in Africa has shown that they are more dynamic than people used to think. Modern concerns end up creeping into ancient stories. There are apparently some sub-Saharan African stories that are supposed to take place hundreds of years ago, where people are reported to be using very modern weapons. So maybe we can't be sure the Irish stories go back unchanged to the Iron Age, let alone the remote Indo-European past. The most recent scholarship doubts seriously whether we can make any actual correlations between the stories and the prehistoric past, and they say further that the medieval Irish people who wrote the legends down weren't trying to do that either. They were trying to create a blend of old traditions and new traditions. They wanted the Irish to have a connection to the classical past. But this means that we don't really know what pre-Christian Irish people thought about their past, and we certainly can't use these stories as a guide to what really happened. Furthermore, we have the two kinds of non-written evidence I mentioned at the beginning, archaeological evidence and DNA analysis. And neither kind of evidence supports the idea of Ireland being peopled by a series of invasions. Archaeological evidence does not show signs of a large-scale movement of peoples into Ireland at the time of the supposed Celtic migrations in the 3rd century or so BC. But it's very interesting to see that while DNA evidence does not show strong correlations between the inhabitants of Ireland and the inhabitants of Central Europe, it does show links between the Irish and the inhabitants of the whole European Atlantic seaboard, including Spain. I'll say more about DNA evidence in a later lecture, but for now, I will leave you with the intriguing possibility that the authors of the Book of Invasions may have accidentally been right. We're going to return to a topic from a previous lecture and focus on what happened to the Celtic-speaking regions of Britain after the withdrawal of the Roman legions. It used to be thought that Roman Britain was destroyed by Germanic invaders, the famous Angles and Saxons and Jutes that English schoolchildren used to learn about. Supposedly, these invaders exterminated the local Romanized but Celtic-speaking population. According to the traditional narrative, Celtic-speaking Britons were progressively pushed westwards by the advance of the newcomers. The result was that the island of Britain was divided into an English-speaking England in the south and east, with a fringe of Celtic speakers in the southwest, west, and northwest. That's the traditional story, and it's the one I learned in school. But it turns out that the story is a lot more complicated and a lot more interesting. The retreat of Celtic speech and culture may have actually been due much more to assimilation than to invasion. I'll say more about this hypothesis later, but let me first lay out what I want to cover in this lecture. I'm going to talk about the beginnings of what later became known as the Celtic Fringe, because the Celtic languages survived on the western coast of the island of Britain, like a fringe all around the English-speaking areas. As English spread from east to west, pockets of Celtic speakers became increasingly isolated from one another in three main areas: the northwest, in what is now northwestern England and southeastern Scotland, the west, in what is now Wales, and the southwest, in what is now Cornwall. I'll be talking much more about Wales in a later lecture, so in this lecture, I will concentrate on the northwest and the southwest. Let's back up to the Roman period. The height of Roman rule in Britain was the 2nd century. We see very prosperous villas in the countryside, and the cities were flourishing as well. Life in Britain carried on fairly well, but starting in the 3rd century, Britain began to be attacked by barbarians. This was a crisis that affected not just Britain, but really the whole of the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. Britain had its own localized barbarian problem. It got hit from two directions. From the west, there were raiders from Ireland. These people were known, confusingly for us, as the Scotti, and this is because, as we have seen, some of them would later settle in Scotland and give their name to that country. But anyway, there are these raiders from Ireland, and then there are also raiders from the northwest coast of Europe, raiders from Germanic-speaking tribes in what are now the Low Countries and northern Germany. They mostly came to Britain on smash-and-grab type raids. They were looking for booty, and especially for slaves. The Romans counteracted this threat by appointing a commander to defend the southeast coast. He was known as the Count of the Saxon Shore. It's a bad sign when you name a part of your territory after the people who are raiding it. In 367 AD, Britain was hit by a perfect storm of barbarian raiders. This episode is known as the Barbarian Conspiracy. That's what it was actually called by a contemporary Roman writer named Ammianus Marcellinus. What seems to have happened is that somehow the Irish to the west and the Picts to the north got together to attack Britain. At the same time, The coast of Gaul was being hit by Germanic raiders, so the Roman authorities there couldn't help. The Count of the Saxon Shore was killed, and all seemed lost until a large Roman army showed up under the future Roman Emperor Theodosius, and they saved the day. The same scenario was repeated a few years later, and the Roman general Stilicho had to come and help. But that kind of rescue was never going to be available to Roman Britain again. And that's because things were steadily getting worse for Rome, and we are headed inexorably towards the fall of Rome. In 406 AD, there was an unusually cold winter, and the Rhine River froze. Large numbers of barbarians from northern Europe simply walked across the river into Roman territory and raided all over the Roman province of Gaul. This was a threat to the security of Rome itself, so Emperor Honorius decided on a fateful step. He ordered the Roman legions in Britain to withdraw to the continent. And he told the residents of Britain, essentially, you're on your own. What happened next? This is where the picture gets murky. The traditional picture of the 5th century is that you get barbarian invasions. Without the Roman troops there to defend the province, the way lies clear for large-scale raiding. And we have a rather poignant record of the reaction of the local population to this alarming turn of events. This is preserved in a work by an author from the 6th century named Gildas, and I'll say more about Gildas in a moment. But he records a very plaintive request for help that the authorities in Britain sent to a Roman commander in Gaul in the middle of the 5th century. The letter reads, "The barbarians push us back to the sea. The sea pushes us back to the barbarians. Between these two kinds of death, we are either drowned or slaughtered." And Gildas notes that Britain got no help in return. So this is very much the story that later written sources tell us. But there is a problem. The archaeological remains from the 5th century do not show much evidence of warfare. They suggest that what you see is not an invasion in the sense of armed bands imposing themselves on an unwilling population. Instead, you see a rather peaceful infiltration. And that is because in the 5th century, the nature of the barbarian problem changed. Up until now, mostly the barbarians had been raiding. They would come, grab what they wanted, maybe burn the rest, kill some people, and then leave. But starting in the mid-5th century, they started staying. You start to see permanent settlements in Britain, especially in the south and east. Now, there's currently some controversy among historians about this process. It used to be thought that these settlers imposed their will by force, that they were conquerors. More recently, some archaeological work has suggested that the process of Germanic settlement in Britain was a gradual one, and it involved assimilation more than violence. But whether it was violent or peaceful or something in between, the new settlers put down permanent roots in Britain. They seem to have settled in rather small bands, perhaps no more than a few dozen people at a time. These people probably brought their women and children with them, either when they first came or later on. But there is also evidence in the DNA of contemporary British cemeteries that there was considerable intermarriage with the native population. The process of assimilation seems to have taken place over several generations. Certainly, some of the British inhabitants, probably especially the elites, did move west and north and southwest into the later Celtic fringe. As far as we can tell, though, many of the British just blended in with the new culture the settlers brought with them. Over time, they adopted the speech of the newcomers, and this is why there is almost no trace left of the British language in modern English. The British simply stopped speaking British and started speaking the language that ultimately became English. There does seem to have been a long period of bilingualism, though, because there are many English place names that are clearly translations of British ones, or they might be double names. For example, Bredon in Leicestershire is made up of the British word for hill, bray, and the English word for hill, dun. So the name Bredon literally means Hill Hill. In a way, the name of this place is a record of the period when the assimilation between the British and the English was going on. But ultimately, English won out, not British, and this is a sign of the kind of cultural attractiveness or military dominance, or probably a little bit of both, that the new settlers were able to exert on the British. Incidentally, since modern speakers of English no longer remember that Doon means hill, the town is now referred to as Bredon on the Hill, which effectively translates as Hill Hill on the Hill. But this assimilation, important as it was only part of the story. In the late 5th and early 6th centuries, there may have been some sort of concerted effort to push back against the new settlers. I mentioned Gildas before, the 6th century writer who recorded that pathetic cry for help to the Roman authorities. Gildas was a British writer, a Christian, who wrote about the history of Britain during the period of barbarian settlement. He says that at the end of the 5th century, a great war leader emerged who fought 12 great battles against the barbarians. The last of these battles, at Mount Badon, was a great victory that halted the advance of the barbarians for 50 years. That is, right up to the time when Gildas was writing, when things were obviously getting bad again. The statement by Gildas seems to be the earliest evidence we have for the existence of the figure who later became known as King Arthur. It's not a lot to go on. Gildas calls this person a war leader, not a king, and in fact, the way he talks about him makes it clear that there are other people who are kings, and that this guy isn't one of them. And he doesn't give him the name Arthur, or in fact any other name. We first get the name Arthur in the early 7th century poem about southern Scotland called the Gododin, and here he isn't called a king either. He is simply mentioned as a warrior that other warriors should be compared to. And we don't even know where Mount Badon was, though lots of people have tried to figure it out. A 9th century writer named Nennius said that Arthur fought 12 battles, but we aren't sure where they were. Still, there is some evidence in the archaeological record that there was indeed a 50-year halt in the advance of Germanic settlement in Britain. On the borders of the southeastern kingdom of Kent, Saxon pottery went out of use for a time. So perhaps we have some confirmation here of the essential truth of the story. Could that halt have been caused by this war leader who may or may not have been called Arthur? Let's review the evidence and assess the arguments. The facts as we know them could support the idea of a famous war leader, not a king, who stemmed the tide of the Germanic advance in Britain. Maybe he was even named Arthur, but there are some important cautions to keep in mind. We cannot be sure that the person Gildas describes and the person mentioned in the poem about the Gododin are the same. We don't have any evidence about that, one way or the other. It may be that Nennius had good reason to think they were the same, but he may just have put the two texts side by side and made a great big assumption, which people down to the present day have been making ever since. We also can't be sure that the pause in settlement that we seem to see in the archaeological record was caused by the activity of the war leader that Gildas mentions. There are plenty of other factors that could have caused a temporary halt in migration. Changes in the political situation back on the continent, maybe, a lack of leadership, any number of other causes. And again, the archaeological record doesn't really support an idea of large-scale military activity at this time. We don't have 12 battlefields to go with Nennius's 12 battles. So I think we need to keep an open mind about Arthur. We don't know if he really existed, or if he did, if he was actually called Arthur. But I think there are two main things we need to take away from this question of whether or not Arthur was real. The first is that the story of the leader Gildas describes does capture a real phenomenon. The British were retreating, at least in terms of their language and culture and political authority, and the Germanic settlers were advancing, whether this was due to assimilation or to military conquest. So the poignant part of the Arthur story, that this is one brief shining moment, and that it will fade into darkness. That is there from the beginning. The second important point, of course, is that we're well on our way to a legend. The story of Arthur had quite a future, and he would later become a Celtic hero who was also adopted by the English. So he was, in fact, a crossover hit. But let's get back to the consequences of the developments we've been talking about in the 5th and 6th centuries. The progressive Anglicization of Eastern Britain led to the areas of Celtic speech becoming more and more isolated from each other. We'll look at two areas where British speech survived for a time, the far north and Cornwall, and we'll leave Wales, the only area where a Celtic language has survived continuously to the present, to another lecture. Let's start with Cornwall. If you look at a map, you can see that it's one of the smaller Celtic areas. It's geographically just about as isolated as you can get without being an island, since it's on a peninsula at the far southwest of Britain, almost completely cut off from England by the Tamar River. This isolation is something that is the stuff of jokes today. A few years ago there were massive floods in Cornwall, and a Cornish MP got up in the House of Commons and said, "The floods were terrible. England was completely cut off." Well, there's a lot in that joke, but it demonstrates how real the geographic factor is in determining Cornish identity. So how did Cornwall get so isolated? Let's go all the way back to what was going on in this part of the island of Britain when the Romans invaded in the 1st century AD. The most important tribe in this area were the Dumnonii, and the region can be referred to as Dumnonia, and this name later became the modern county name Devon. The area they ruled fell outside of the area I mentioned in an earlier lecture that was under heavy Roman influence even before the Roman invasion. The area where native rulers were minting coins in imitation of the continent. That was not happening in Dumnonia. That's an indication of the relative isolation of this region. Then we have Roman rule, of course, followed by the arrival of the Angles and Saxons in the 5th century. As I mentioned, the newcomers did not eradicate the existing population or even drive them westwards. We're not talking about hordes of refugees fleeing west. There's no evidence for that. You do see a lot of language in modern textbooks that makes you think along these lines, statements like the British were driven westwards. It's not really true. Really, we're talking not so much about who is there, but about who is in charge. Slowly but surely, elite groups of Saxons extended their control westwards down into the peninsula that contains Cornwall, Devon, and Somerset, until, by the middle of the 7th century, Dumnonia is cut off from other speakers of British in Wales and in the northwest, at least by land. It's hard to explain why the sea was sometimes a highway as it was between, say, Ireland and Scotland in the early 7th century, and sometimes a barrier, which seems to be the case here. So this naturally begins to cause the languages to diverge, as people were not in quite as much contact with each other anymore. By the 10th century, the Saxon kingdom of Wessex had extended its rule westwards deep into Dumnonia, all the way to the Tamar River, and all that was left to native rulers was the extreme western part of Dumnonia, namely Caernarfon, and the name Cornwall came from Caernarfon plus the Germanic word Wallace, which was just the word for British speakers. And incidentally, Wallace is where we get the word Wales. Of course, Cornwall did have something going for it, namely a pretty powerful legend. If Arthur lived any place, perhaps he lived at the remote Cornish site known as Tintagel, which is a very impressive early medieval fortress that still survives. Tintagel seems to have functioned as an actual royal center for the kingdom of Dumnonia. We'll probably never know for sure about this, but it has been fabulous for tourism. You'll find hotels and restaurants in Tintagel called things like King Arthur's Castle Hotel and Camelot. Of course, where Arthur comes from is a bit like where St. Patrick comes from. We don't really know. Arthur belongs to all of Celtic Britain. But with another famous story, we can be sure of its specifically Cornish associations. This is the story of Tristan and Isolde. which became a certifiable medieval smash bestseller. And later, of course, it served as the basis for a famous opera composed by Richard Wagner. The story is about King Mark of Cornwall and his nephew Tristan, and the woman who comes between them. Tristan is sent to fetch his uncle's bride from Ireland. This is, of course, an arranged marriage. So there is a magic potion that is supposed to make Isolde and King Mark fall in love. But instead, Tristan and Isolde drink the potion and they fall in love with each other, and Isolde marries Mark anyway, and then the lovers get back together, and, spoiler alert, everybody dies, which makes it a great topic for an opera. There are many modern film versions as well. This is just to make a case for the cultural importance of Cornwall. This Cornish story became famous throughout Europe and is obviously still quite resonant today. But the establishment of English political control eventually took a toll on Cornish distinctiveness. We will see in the next lecture that there was some emigration out of Cornwall and Devon to France and Spain, but Cornish remained the language of Cornwall down through the Middle Ages. And in a way, the use of Latin held to it this. As long as the medieval English government used Latin for day-to-day business, and the church used Latin for the liturgy, people did not need to give up speaking Cornish to be part of the kingdom, and also part of European learned society. So what happened to Cornish? One thing was that in the 15th century, the English government started doing more of its business in English. So there was increasingly an incentive for the Cornish elites to learn English in order to interact more effectively with the central government. Still, the vast majority of Cornish people were speaking Cornish every day. A huge turning point came in the 16th century with the Protestant Reformation, which had a big impact in Cornwall. In 1549, the newly Protestant government imposed a new English prayer book on the people, and they rose in rebellion. There was a lot of conservative religious sentiment in Cornwall, so they objected to the new prayer book being Protestant, but they also objected to its being in English. The central government was a little puzzled. They said, look, before this you had Latin in the Mass, which you didn't understand, and now you have English, which you don't understand, so what's the difference? But there was a difference, and everybody knew it. With Latin, the Cornish people were on an equal footing with everyone else in the kingdom. The liturgy was not in anybody's native language. Now, the liturgy was in the language of the people who had established hegemony over Cornwall, and who were still seen as alien by the Cornish. So the people took up arms. This was called the Prayer Book Rebellion, and it was suppressed with tremendous savagery. Possibly as many as 4,000 people were slaughtered, which was one of the largest death tolls in any medieval English rebellion, probably far higher than in the far more famous Peasants' Revolt of 1381, when rebels actually took over large parts of London. This rebellion in Cornwall is remembered there to this day. There is a monument that was erected in Pendrine in 1999 in memory of the victims on the 450th anniversary. It's bilingual in English and Cornish, and the Cornish text comes first. In 2007, the Bishop of Truro apologized formally for the massacre. The suppression of the revolt was the beginning of a very long and slow decline in the Cornish language. Cornish was not taught in school, of course. Mass education was a problem for all the Celtic languages. You can follow on a map the relentless westward marginalization of Cornish. People in the 17th and 18th century were actually quite aware of this development, and it was discussed in the popular press. In the late 18th century, a woman named Dolly Pentreath became famous for supposedly being the last native speaker of Cornish. There are other candidates, but a very widely circulated engraving of Dolly Pentreath gave her particular notoriety. Starting in the late 19th century, however, a movement began to revive the Cornish language, and we will talk later in the course, in more general terms, about the Celtic revival movements. Don't count out Cornish yet. One other interesting aspect of Cornish is that it actually is fairly close in its sounds to the English spoken in the United States. The Cornish accent in English was obviously affected by the language that underlay the English. It's an accent that does have an R sound, which is something that many varieties of English within Britain do not have. Many immigrants from this part of Britain ended up sailing to the United States, where their speech patterns affected the accent that developed in the new country. So Americans owe at least part of their accent, which is marked strongly by the presence of the R, to the Cornish. You can often recognize Cornish people by their very distinctive names because Cornish names tend to contain the same few elements, such as Tray, a settlement or homestead, as in Sir Charles Trevelyan, the infamous British civil servant who oversaw the inadequate British response to the Irish potato famine, or Pen, a headland, as in Dolly Pentreath, the last native Cornish speaker. And notice that pen here is cognate with the Welsh word for head that I mentioned in my lecture on the Celtic languages. In fact, there is a rhyme that helps you pick out who the Cornish people are from their names. By Tray, Pole, and Pen, you shall know the Cornish men. Possible, though, that the most famous Cornish person around these days is a fictional character, namely Sybil Trelawney, the rather scatterbrained teacher of divination in the Harry Potter books, who was memorably portrayed in the Harry Potter films by Emma Thompson. Let's move now from Cornwall to the north of Britain, to what was later called Hen Ogledd, the Old North. These are the areas of what is now northern England and southern Scotland that remained British-speaking after the fall of the Roman Empire, and then even after the settlement of the Germanic-speaking newcomers starting in the 5th century. British speech survived in the north for a long time, but much longer on the west coast than on the east coast. We tend to refer to the language spoken in this area as Cumbric, which comes from the name Cumbria. Cumbria became the name of a county, and it is also related to the later Welsh word that refers to Wales, Cymru. So the relationship between the languages spoken in these two regions, Wales and the Northwest, is clear. This is one language area, and these people saw themselves as linguistically and culturally connected. These links operated not just within the North, but also between the North and Wales. In fact, we know most of what we know about the Old North precisely because stories and genealogies about the Old North were preserved in Wales. The Welsh were aware of their linguistic cousins to the north and felt that the northern legacy was theirs to hold on to even after the northern British kingdoms had passed away. But even within the north, these British or Cumbric-speaking areas were by no means politically united. There were at least 3 small British kingdoms in the Old North, one on the east coast and 2 on the west coast, each of which suffered different fates. And I'll talk about them in the order in which they passed from the political scene. Let's start with Gododdin, which is the area around Edinburgh. The name Gododdin derives from the tribal name Votadini. The Votadini were a British tribe that lived in southern Scotland at the time of the Roman conquest. I mentioned Gododdin in the context of the growth of the Arthur legend, since it is in a poem about this kingdom that the name Arthur is first found in connection with a great hero. Gododdin did not last very long as an independent entity. It was conquered by the Angles in the 7th century, and as I said in an earlier lecture, this conquest is the reason why lowland Scotland speaks English to this day. In general, the British language fared badly on the eastern seaboard of northern Britain, since this is precisely where the new settlers had taken root, and where they were expanding northwards. This was easier for them than trying to cross the Pennine Mountains, which run down the center of northern Britain. On the western side of Scotland, the British language did better. The British kingdom of Freged straddled the borders of what are now England and Scotland. The most famous stories that come out of Freged concern a famous king called Irian, who lived in the late 6th century. These stories later got pulled into the cycle of stories about King Arthur. Irian of Freged fought against the rulers of the Anglian or English kingdom of Bernicia, northern Northumbria, who were trying to extend their dominance from the east coast of Britain to the west. The kingdom of Freged held out until the early 8th century, when it was finally swallowed up by a united Northumbria. The British kingdom of Strathclyde was located to the north of Freged. It was named for the valley of the River Clyde. Strath means valley. This is where Glasgow is located now. Strathclyde survived quite a bit longer than the other kingdoms of the Old North into the 11th century. But unlike the Dothan and Freged, Strathclyde was conquered not by the Northumbrians, but by the Gaelic-speaking kingdom of Alba, which had formed from a union of the Irish and the Picts. The British language was spoken in the area of Glasgow down to the 12th and 13th centuries, when it was finally replaced by Gaelic and much later, of course, by English. There was definitely a strong memory, even into the later Middle Ages, that this area had been British-speaking. The famous Sir William Wallace was probably the descendant of Cumbric speakers in Strathclyde. His name, Wallace, came from the same English word for British speakers that gave us the name Wales. So the three regions of British speech that survived the fall of the Roman Empire in northern Britain underwent different fates depending on their geographic proximity to more powerful neighbors, either the Kingdom of Northumbria or the Kingdom of Alba or Scotland. For many centuries, though, there was considerable contact between the North and Wales. The Welsh, of course, preserved their political autonomy for hundreds of years after the end came for our Hen Ogledd. It is only because the Welsh continued to communicate with the other areas of British speech and regarded those people as engaged in a common enterprise that we know anything much about the literary traditions and royal dynasties of the North. So let's wrap up by reviewing the different fates of the areas of Celtic speech that survived the fall of Rome and the advance of the English language. At one end of the spectrum is Wales, which we'll talk about more in a later lecture. Wales kept its culture and its language, and Welsh is still widely spoken today. At the other end of the spectrum is the Old North, where Celtic speech died out in the Middle Ages, in some cases as early as the 7th or 8th century. Finally, Cornwall is at something like a halfway point on the spectrum between the Old North and Wales. It lost its political independence, if anything, earlier than the Old North, but it managed to keep its language far longer, down to the 18th century, and there are efforts to revive Cornish today that have been at least somewhat successful. There are even fledgling efforts to revive Cumbric in what is now northern England. But I think they are destined to have less success than the rather modest gains that have been made in Cornwall. It has been 1,000 years since British speech was used in northern England. I think it's probably too long ago for a successful revival. But I could be proven wrong. The Old North could rise again. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us tonight. If you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can keep creating quiet stories for curious minds. Rest well, and remember there's always more. History waiting just beyond the horizon. This has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.